Jake Thompson stood in the cold night air, his dark blue uniform blending into the shadows of the towering government building behind him. The dim streetlights cast long, flickering beams across the pavement, but no one noticed him. He was just another security guard, a nameless figure watching over a place filled with men whose names shaped history. Every night, he stood there, silent and unseen, his presence as forgettable as the wind moving through the empty corridors he patrolled. Yet Jake was more than a guard. He had once been a soldier, a leader on the battlefield, where his decisions had meant the difference between life and death. He had served his country for 8 years, surviving grueling deployments in the Middle East, where he had faced the kind of hardship most people couldn't even imagine. But when he returned home, the world he had fought for no longer had a place for him. He had believed, like so many others, that his service would open doors, that the discipline, leadership, and resilience he had developed in the military would translate into a new career. Instead, he was met with rejection after rejection. Employers looked at his military background with hesitation, seeing only a man trained for war, not for the corporate world. "We're looking for candidates with industry experience. Your resume is impressive, but we're concerned that military culture may not align with our company. Thank you for your service, but we've decided to move forward with another candidate." The polite dismissals had stacked up like unread letters, each one another reminder that the world had moved on without him. The once decorated soldier had become invisible, reduced to standing at the gates of power, watching as politicians and high-ranking officials walked past him, never sparing him a second glance. His job paid the bills, but it offered no future, no purpose. It was a cruel irony on the battlefield. He had been responsible for lives, trusted with missions that required absolute precision. Now his greatest responsibility was ensuring that doors remained locked and that people signed in at the front desk. Every night, as he stood at attention, his mind wandered. If life had taken a slightly different turn, could he have been one of the men stepping through those doors? Could he have been sitting at those long conference tables, making decisions instead of guarding them? But the thoughts never lingered for long. They couldn't. He had learned to bury them, just as he had buried so many things from his past. His duty now was simple: stand, watch, protect. And so, night after night, he stood in the cold, fading further into the background, becoming just another uniform in the endless machinery of Washington, D.C. Yet fate, as it often does, had other plans. Jake had no idea that on this particular night, his life was about to take a turn he could never have predicted. He didn't know that soon, someone was going to see him not just as a guard, not just as another forgotten soldier, but as something more. He had no way of knowing that the man who would change everything was about to step out of a black car and look him directly in the eye. Because sometimes the smallest moments, the ones we don't expect, the ones we don't even dare to hope for, are the ones that change everything. Jake Thompson had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible. Every night, dressed in his dark blue uniform, he stood guard at the grand government building, a silent protector no one noticed. The world had moved on without him. He was just a security guard now, a shadow among the powerful. But tonight, something was different. A shift in the air. A moment he never saw coming. As the clock crept past midnight, the hum of approaching vehicles broke the stillness. Jake straightened his posture, his eyes scanning the street as a sleek convoy of black SUVs rolled into the courtyard. Headlights sliced through the darkness, reflecting off the towering glass windows. He didn't need to see the flags on the front of the vehicles to know who was arriving. The man had been here countless times before, but never, not once, had he acknowledged Jake's presence. Until now. The convoy slowed to a stop. The back door of the lead SUV swung open, and within seconds, a team of Secret Service agents spread out, scanning the area with practiced precision. Then, stepping out of the car, Donald Trump emerged. Even without the cameras, without the crowds, he carried a presence that was impossible to ignore. Dressed in a sharp black suit, his movements were deliberate, his confidence unwavering. Jake had watched countless officials enter this building, senators, cabinet members, advisors. But this was different. As Trump approached the entrance, he suddenly stopped, and for the first time he looked directly at Jake. "How's your night going, officer?" Jake hesitated for a fraction of a second. In all his years working security, no one of Trump's stature had ever spoken to him. He quickly composed himself, standing taller. "All good, sir." Trump nodded, but he didn't move on. Instead, he studied Jake for a long moment, his gaze sharp, assessing. It wasn't the quick, detached glance of a busy man acknowledging protocol. No, this was something else, something intentional. "You served in the military, didn't you?" Trump's voice was low but firm. Jake blinked. He wasn't wearing any medals, no insignia to indicate his past. Yet somehow Trump had seen it in him. "Yes, sir, 8 years in the Army." Trump nodded again, slower this time, as if confirming something he had already suspected. 8 years, that's a long time. His eyes didn't leave Jake's. "And now you're here." A quiet tension settled between them. Jake knew that Trump wasn't mocking him, but hearing those words out loud still struck a nerve. Because yes, now he was here. After everything he had given, after every sacrifice he had made, this was where he had ended up a security guard standing outside doors he would never be invited through. "I handle security for this building, sir," Jake said simply, keeping his voice level. Trump kept his gaze locked on him, then did something unexpected. He smiled. Not condescending, not dismissive, but as if he had just discovered something interesting. "Tell me," Trump said, tilting his head slightly, "do you think this building is truly secure?" Jake's breath hitched for half a second. Was this a test? A trick question? He had spent years in the military, trained to assess threats, anticipate weaknesses, and yet no one had ever asked for his opinion on security, not here. Not once. Carefully, he chose his words. "I believe we do our best to keep it safe, sir." Trump narrowed his eyes slightly, considering his response. Then, with a knowing look, he said, "Doing your best doesn't always mean it's enough." Jake swallowed. He knew that was true. He had seen countless security flaws, blind spots in surveillance cameras, weak checkpoints, access routes that could be exploited. But who was he to suggest changes? He was just a guard, someone whose job was to follow orders, not give them. But then Trump's voice cut through his hesitation. "If you had the power to change the security system here, what would you do differently?" Jake's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure what stunned him more, the fact that he was being asked, or the fact that Trump actually wanted an answer. A dozen ideas rushed through his mind, things he had noticed for months but had never voiced. "There are a few areas that could be improved, sir," Jake admitted, his voice steady but careful. Trump gave a slight nod, a look of interest flickering across his face. "Good. I'll be back soon. When I am, I want to hear your thoughts." Jake barely had time to process the words before Trump turned and stepped into the building, leaving him standing there with a storm of questions racing through his mind. Had that really just happened? Was Trump serious, or was it just small talk? For the first time in years, Jake felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. Because if Trump meant what he said, if he truly wanted to hear his ideas, then maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just another night standing in the cold. Maybe this was the moment that would change everything. Jake Thompson could hardly believe what had just happened. Donald Trump, one of the most powerful men in the country, had not only noticed him, but had also asked for his thoughts on something as critical as national security. The weight of that conversation pressed on him like a live wire, sending jolts of uncertainty and excitement coursing through his body. He had spent years standing guard in the shadows, dismissed by the world, unseen by the people he once fought to protect. But now, for the first time since leaving the battlefield, someone had not only acknowledged his existence, but had asked for his expertise. As the weeks passed, the memory of that night stayed with him. He replayed Trump's words in his head, trying to decide if they had been just a fleeting moment of curiosity or something more. He wanted to believe that it meant something, that the former president had seen potential in him. But doubt had a way of creeping in, whispering that it was nothing more than empty words. After all, why would someone like Donald Trump care about a nameless security guard? And yet, something inside him refused to let it go. If there was even the slightest chance that Trump had been serious, then he couldn't afford to ignore it. He had spent too many years waiting for opportunities that never came. He had stood on the sidelines, watching as others built their futures while his own remained frozen in place. Not this time. If there was an opening, even the smallest crack in the door, he would push through it. So every night after his shift, instead of heading home, Jake stayed late. He studied the security protocols of the building, paying closer attention to its vulnerabilities. He took notes on weak points in surveillance coverage, areas where response times were too slow, and access points that could be exploited by someone with enough determination. He knew that he wasn't the most qualified person for this kind of work. He didn't have a degree in cybersecurity. He wasn't a high-ranking intelligence officer, but he did have experience. Years of military service had taught him how to think like an enemy, to see weaknesses before they became catastrophic failures. What he lacked in credentials, he made up for with an obsessive dedication to preparation. He spent his nights researching modern security advancements, comparing the protocols he saw in place with the latest strategies used by elite agencies. He wasn't just preparing for another conversation, he was preparing for a moment that might never come. Then, 3 weeks later, it did. Jake had just finished his shift, the exhaustion of another long night weighing heavily on his shoulders, when the familiar roar of black SUVs pulling into the courtyard caught his attention. The sleek vehicles came to a slow stop, their headlights cutting through the darkness, and within seconds, a team of Secret Service agents stepped out, forming their protective perimeter. Jake knew the routine well. Trump had been here before, and every time, the drill was the same. But this time, as the former president stepped out of the car, something was different. Trump didn't just walk past him like he had so many times before. He stopped. Jake straightened instinctively, his posture snapping to attention as he met Trump's gaze. "I told you to prepare some ideas, didn't I?" Trump's voice was calm but firm, carrying that unmistakable authority that commanded a room. Jake felt the familiar tightening in his chest, that split-second moment of panic when everything hinged on the next few words. But he had prepared for this. He had spent the last 3 weeks running through every possible scenario, every answer, every contingency. He took a steady breath. "Yes, sir." Trump gave a small nod, then motioned with his hand. "Good. Let's hear it." For a fraction of a second, Jake hesitated. Not because he wasn't ready, he was, but because this moment felt almost surreal. A month ago, he had been invisible. Now, he was being asked to speak. He launched into his assessment, outlining the vulnerabilities he had observed over the years. He pointed out areas where surveillance cameras had blind spots, security checkpoints that were too easily bypassed, emergency response delays that could be exploited. His voice remained steady, each word chosen carefully, delivering his analysis with the confidence of someone who had spent years thinking about these problems. Behind Trump, a few of the Secret Service agents exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such a thorough, well-thought-out response from a security guard. When Jake finished, Trump was silent for a moment. He studied Jake carefully, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he gave a slow nod. "I like the way you think." Jake barely had time to process those words before Trump turned to one of his aides. "Set up a meeting. I want to see what he's capable of." Jake felt the ground shift beneath him. A meeting? A real meeting? His mind raced, struggling to keep up with what was happening. He had spent years trying to move up in the world of security, applying for promotions, hoping for a break that never came. And now, in a single moment, a door had just been opened, one that he had never expected. One that he couldn't afford to let close. He didn't know what the meeting would entail. He didn't know if this was just another test or something bigger. But what he did know was this: he wouldn't waste it. As Trump disappeared into the building, Jake stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt something more than just duty. He felt purpose. This wasn't just another night on the job. This was his chance, and he would do whatever it took to prove that he deserved it. Jake Thompson couldn't sleep that night. His mind was racing, replaying every moment of his conversation with Donald Trump. A meeting had been set, a real opportunity, something he had been denied for years, was now in front of him. But with that opportunity came a crushing weight, the pressure to prove himself, to show that he wasn't just another security guard standing outside a building, unnoticed and unimportant. He had spent years watching from the sidelines. Now, he was stepping into the game. For the next several days, Jake buried himself in preparation. He studied the security protocols of the building in even greater detail, going through every report he had access to, analyzing every pattern he could detect. He rewatched footage of previous drills, noting response times, identifying areas where security personnel hesitated or where a breach could occur undetected. He wasn't just preparing for a conversation, he was preparing to prove his worth. Then, just before dawn on the day of his meeting, something happened that would change everything. The building had been quiet for most of the night. Jake had done his usual rounds, walking the dimly lit hallways, listening to the familiar hum of security monitors, feeling the comforting weight of routine settle over him. But as he reached the control room, a sudden noise shattered the stillness. A piercing alarm blared through the facility, red warning lights flashing across the screens. The monitors flickered with movement, unauthorized access. A breach. Jake's heart pounded as he scanned the surveillance feeds. A shadowy figure was moving through a restricted area of the building, slipping through corridors where no one should be at this hour. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass. Someone had found a way in without setting off any exterior alarms. One of the officers in the room hesitated, fingers hovering over the radio. "Might be a system glitch," he muttered. But Jake didn't believe in coincidences. His instincts screamed at him, this wasn't a glitch. This was real. Without waiting for orders, Jake grabbed the radio. "We have an intruder," he said, his voice sharp, decisive. "I need a team to move toward the southwest corridor immediately." The others hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Then a voice cut through the tension from behind him. "Do as he says." Jake turned sharply. Donald Trump stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding the room without effort. The Secret Service agents nearby stiffened, immediately shifting their attention to the situation. That was all the confirmation the team needed. Within seconds, a tactical unit mobilized, moving toward the flagged sector. Jake followed closely, his pulse hammering as he instinctively reached for his sidearm. For the first time since leaving the military, he felt the rush of adrenaline he had once known so well. This wasn't training. This wasn't routine. This was real. As they approached the restricted area, the emergency lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The air was thick with tension, no movement, no signs of an intruder. One of the agents whispered, "Might be nothing." Jake wasn't convinced. He crouched down, scanning the ground. Then he saw a single footprint in the dust. Fresh. His gut tightened. He signaled for the team to spread out, eyes sharp, ears tuned to the silence. Every second felt stretched, every breath held. Then a voice from the far end of the room. "Over here, we've got something." Jake hurried over. Nestled against an electrical panel, barely visible, was a small device, a data interception tool. Unauthorized surveillance. His stomach dropped. This wasn't just a break-in. Someone had planted this to extract data, or worse, to gain access to the building's entire security network. If they hadn't caught it in time, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Trump stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the device. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands, his expression hardening. "You see," he said, his voice low, deliberate, "I told you, doing your best isn't always enough." Jake exhaled, steadying himself. He had spotted the breach, he had taken control of the response, and now, standing in front of Trump, he knew he had proven something. The former president turned to his aides. "I want to know who did this, and I want to know now." Jake stood there, his hands clenched into fists. He had worked so hard to prove himself worthy of an opportunity, but now it wasn't just about proving himself anymore. This was bigger than him. This was real. Trump turned back to him, his expression unreadable. "Tomorrow," he said, "you're no longer a security guard. I have a new job for you." Jake's breath caught in his throat. Everything had changed. Jake sat in a small office tucked away in the depths of the building, his fingers gripping the edges of a document stamped with an official seal from Trump's office. It wasn't just a letter, it was a challenge. A temporary assignment as a security advisor. A chance to prove that everything he had learned, everything he had endured, had led him to this moment. But along with the opportunity came the weight of expectation. Within 1 week, Jake had to submit a comprehensive security report, analyzing every vulnerability in the building's defense system, every weak spot, every overlooked flaw, every possible solution. He had spent years as a security guard, unnoticed and unacknowledged, but now, the man who had walked past him countless times had stopped, listened, and placed an enormous task on his shoulders. It was more responsibility than he had ever been given outside the military. And the truth was, he didn't know if he was ready. Doubt gnawed at him as he scanned the blueprints of the facility, his mind racing with strategies. A team of experts would take a month to complete a report like this. He had 7 days. He wasn't a cybersecurity specialist. He wasn't a high-ranking strategist. He was just Jake Thompson, the former soldier who had once stood outside these very doors with nothing but questions about his future. But if there was one thing he knew how to do, it was adapt. So he worked. Every night after his shift, he stayed late, poring over documents, analyzing surveillance footage, learning everything he could about modern security technologies. He retraced the steps of past security breaches, noting patterns, identifying weaknesses, questioning why no one had addressed them before. And then, on the 4th night, frustration set in. He stared at the mess of notes scattered across his desk, exhaustion weighing on him. What if he wasn't enough? What if this was all a mistake? Then, the door swung open. Trump walked in alone. Jake sat up straighter, his muscles instinctively tightening as the former president pulled out a chair and sat across from him. He didn't look at the mess of papers on the desk. Instead, he looked straight at Jake. "How far have you gotten?" Trump asked. Jake exhaled, pushing a few documents toward him. "I've identified some weak points, but putting together a foolproof plan, I'm not sure I can do it, sir." Trump studied him for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "Do you know what separates a leader from everyone else?" Jake remained silent, waiting. "They don't need to have all the answers," Trump continued. "They just need to know how to find them." Jake frowned slightly. "What do you mean? You had a team in the military, didn't you? When you were on the battlefield, did you do everything alone?" And suddenly, Jake understood. He wasn't supposed to do this alone. He had spent so long thinking that proving himself meant handling everything himself. But leaders weren't the ones with all the answers. They were the ones who knew how to bring the right people together. Trump stood up, giving Jake a firm pat on the shoulder. "I didn't pick you because you know everything. I picked you because you know how to fight for solutions. 1 week is enough if you learn how to work smart." Jake sat there for a few moments after Trump left, his mind clearer than it had been in days. This wasn't just about proving himself anymore. This was about stepping up, about being a leader. And that's exactly what he did. He reached out to cybersecurity specialists, former military strategists, and senior security personnel, gathering their insights, verifying his ideas, and refining his recommendations. He didn't pretend to have all the answers, but he made damn sure he found them. At the end of the week, he submitted a full security report, detailed, precise, and undeniable. And that very night, his theories were put to the test. An unauthorized breach. Jake was ready. His recommendations had predicted this exact weak point, and because of that, they caught it in time. He wasn't just a security guard anymore. He was the one who had prevented a crisis before it even began. The next morning, Trump made it official. "You're not a security guard anymore. You work for me now." Jake had spent years thinking he had been forgotten, that all the effort, the discipline, the sacrifices he had made in the military had been for nothing. But now, he knew the truth. All it took was one moment, one opportunity, one chance to prove that he was more than just another face in the background. He had taken that chance, and he had won. How many people out there are just like Jake? Talented, hardworking, waiting for someone to notice them. How many dreams have been abandoned simply because no one was willing to listen? Jake's story isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. At some point in life, each of us will stand before a defining moment. A moment that could change everything. But the question is, will you have the courage to take it? Maybe the next person isn't Jake. Maybe it's you. If this story inspired you, comment 1. If you think we can improve, comment 2. And if you want to hear more powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.